Welcome to the Wounds That Do Not Heal. My name is Tressa Brady. After my own experience and hearing time and time again about domestic violence in military families, I decided to start this podcast. Tune in for stories, resources, and guidance on how to get the support you need for your family and your safety. It's Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and I have found myself contemplating quite a bit the systemic failures in this country and the world that contribute over and over again to the death of women and children and the generational trauma that will likely transcend for decades through their family trees. I think about the inadequate ways in which this world handles domestic violence, predominantly against women. And I find myself thinking about who's to blame and how we can right this ship. And I get angry at one party in particular, and it's not the abusers themselves. Most of them aren't worth it. So many abusers are actually victims of a terrible childhood or systemic failures of foster care or the product of parents who were addicts, kids born maybe even exposed to substances in the womb themselves. Honestly, there's so many devastating scenarios that can predispose a person to a violent and crime-ridden life. And that's not to make excuses for abusers. But sometimes, quite frankly, abusers are just products of their environment who didn't stand much of a chance. They're kids raised in challenging areas who don't have the highest IQs. But then I also think about abusers who are just bad seeds, narcissistic people who had good childhoods, maybe even silver spoons in their mouth, and they have no excuses, but they just ended up being entitled pieces of shit. I think about all of these factors, nature versus nurture, the types of abuse and the ways in which women and children find themselves trapped or running for their lives and never able to rest without the fear that their abusers will find them. I think about the one party who I believe holds a lot of the blame because they're also the one party who has the most power, education, and ability to make changes, and they choose not to. That can sum up a lot of unscrupulous professionals, but in particular, today I'm talking about the judges who continually let abusers off, who look at these women who are begging for their lives and who dismiss them as lost causes. These people aren't worth their time. They hear them plead to not make their children go to their abusers. They see them begging for protective restraining orders and reprieve from the torture that they've been enduring, all because they refuse to stay with the person who may kill them. They beg the judges not to let their abuser out on bail because that means they'll come kill them. And the judges have either grown callous to the victims that are trapped within that domestic violence wheel, or they're just incapable of empathy and they care only about churning out cases and not the results of their actions. They choose not to act, even though they have the power to help these women and children. But there is one judge in particular I want to talk about today. And it's because he, like a lot of judges in this country, is directly responsible for women being killed. His negligence and inability to consider a history of violence, a long history of violence in the defendants he sees means people die. Despite him having all the proof in the world, his leniency on criminals has ultimately cost victims their lives or caused them to nearly die. And I'm mad. Women will often do what they're supposed to. They will call 911 and ask for help. They believe cops when the cops say, if you press charges, we will get them away from you. They press charges. They do their part. They trust that the judicial system will protect them, and they get let down. This is why it shouldn't be surprising that one of the most common reasons women stay with their abusers is because they know the court won't punish the abusers. They'll get away with it, and then they will retaliate for the woman trying to expose them. And these abusers, every time they get away with an offense or multiple offenses, their invincibility grows, and then they act out in much more dangerous ways. This week on my TikTok page, I shared a story about a loved one of mine. Now, I didn't acknowledge it there, but it was actually my ex-husband's second wife, whom I referred to as Faith before in past episodes. I'm going to recap that story real quickly because it pertains to this week's episode and actually inspired the topic of this week's episode, because we're going to be talking about the dangers within our judicial system to victims of domestic violence. So my ex-husband, whom I refer to as Chris, he terrorizes Faith despite the fact she left him about 3 years ago. And he's had like 4 fiancés since, just serial proposals and women who's moved in with him and moved out after he hurt them. He continues to stalk, harass, and make false police reports against Faith and their children. More than anything, it's that he's hurting their children. And she's done everything a mother could possibly do. She's exhausted every resource. She's worked tirelessly, self-sacrificing everything to protect those children from him. And yet the state of Texas continues to give him access to those children. There's this crazy misconception that courts always side with the woman, when from what I've seen in courts, they're not inherently biased against men, but there's a pervasive gender bias against women. Judges will act as if women are being over-emotional or erratic, even hysterical. You know, the old womb hysteria syndrome. Women are hysterical when they're upset. And in court, maybe in that moment, they may seem that way. And rightfully so, because in all likelihood, they have been stalked and harassed and had their children endangered for years before finally getting in front of a judge to plead their case. And so they're desperate to be heard and protected. And when they get in front of the judge, they feel like that's their chance. What the judge is seeing is desperation to protect them and their children. They want their child's safety ensured, to stop the courts from making them hand their children over to a person who has hurt that child and threatened to and may even kill them. So the woman seems hysterical. And then the abuser will roll into court, cool as a cucumber, unbothered, and they'll proceed to claim that they are the victim of parental alienation. And the judge will act as if the abuser is the actual victim. Sometimes they'll even be charmed by a narcissistic abuser. If we look at even the judge back in the case of Ted Bundy, he was enamored by the man, complimenting him and saying he should go to law school. I mean, come on. It's not uncommon for abusers to walk away with partial or even full custody of children. And you know the person who often gets charged under failure to protect laws when there's DV in the home by the dad is the mom. The legal system is not set up to favor women, not by a long shot. So back to what I posted yesterday. Okay, my loved one, Faith, she's been dragged through hell and back. She has had guns in her face, her life threatened, she's been attacked. Honestly, if you can name it, this man has done it. But she is fierce. She has stayed so steadfast and strong in her survival to protect her children. But the state of Texas just doesn't care. So to back up, a few years ago, our ex-husband hurt her son, their son, very badly. And it's taken 3 years for the DA to get that to court. There have been numerous other incidences since then, but this is the first one that has finally made it all the way to court. Because apparently they're so backed up in this tiny county in Texas. So they get to court, and this mother effer pleads guilty to a felony, and he's laughing and rolling his eyes. He's making fun of Faith because she showed up and pushed it this far. He's laughing and saying she's ridiculous and making a mountain out of a molehill, when in reality, the DA actually pursued it this far because he broke a bone of his son's. But nevertheless, he pleads guilty. He finds it hilarious. He gets a plea deal. He gets community service and probation, no jail time at this time. And what's worse is he won't care. He won't be affected. He probably won't even do the community service and won't get in trouble because he never has. In all likelihood, he'll do some event with the Wounded Warrior Foundation where they tote him around as this major superhero and people show up to sing his praises and tell him how enamored they are with him. He'll probably talk about what it's like to be a wounded warrior and a father, and people will say, what an amazing dad he is, not knowing and probably not caring that he literally is there to check a box for beating his child. In the past, he's been celebrated at the Warrior Games and recognized at an event on Dancing with the Stars back when I was with him. I'm dead serious. That night after that event, he actually pushed me out of a moving vehicle. So anyways, there's so much he's gotten away with and more, and so much men like this get away with. They get to be hailed around the country as heroes, all the while leaving just a trail of countless women behind them who they've stalked, beaten, strangled, sexually assaulted, and more. And the worst part of all of this, even with the felony conviction for beating a child, is he gets to keep his custody portion for now because Texas, like many other states, does not care about the safety of women or children. So Faith has to turn her child over to this man this weekend for his regular visits. Last week at his visit, he injured the child and threatened to kill him. So she called CPS and said, this is what happened. And they said, take it up with the DA when you go to court next week, or the prosecutor, tell your lawyer. So she did. When she got to court, she mentioned it, and they said, you have to suppress that. That's not relevant to this case today. Do not speak about that. And they directed her to call CPS. So essentially a game of hot potato with her child's life. Now this guy, he is more than capable of killing somebody. And he's threatened suicide a lot in the past. My biggest fear is that he goes through with the murder-suicide, but nobody will listen to her or I. We're just hysterical women. So Faith says to her lawyer, I can't give my baby to him. What happens if I refuse to give him? What happens if I don't turn him over to him? He could kill him. I'm afraid for his life. And her lawyer says, well, then you would be in contempt of the custody agreement and you could be arrested and put in jail. So let me get this straight. Me, Tressa, I'm trying to wrap my brain around this. You're telling me a man can beat, stalk, harass, and literally terrorize a woman for years, harm their children, hurt animals, and be a menace to society in general and never serve jail time. He can plead guilty to a felony, 0 jail time at this point, even though a felony literally is supposed to be a year by definition, but 0 jail time so far, just probation and community service. So if a mother then exercises her right and quite frankly her duty to protect the life of her child, then and only then will jail time come into play? You, Texas. That's all I have to say. And you know what, though? I'm making it sound like this is the Texas problem. People actually have a misconception that these things are only happening in states like Texas and Florida and South Carolina, where they're not known to be progressive states, and they think that it's a party line problem and a state problem, and that is not the case. Arizona, Colorado, Washington, even California, I've heard from women in all of these states and plenty of other states as well and other countries that they're doing this to domestic violence victims. I live in Southern California, which is arguably the most progressive systems. And there are numerous groups here that are very vocal about judges in court cases that are just like this that I've just talked to you about. And I saw it described really well by an expert on Instagram, what's going on with family court. So I actually want to credit her because these are her words. Her name is Tina Swiffen, and she's the author of the best-selling book called Divorcing a Narcissist. She's extremely knowledgeable on the fallacies and abuse that happen in courts to victims of domestic violence. So her social media handle is @OneMomsBattle. So go give Tina a follow because she just has a lot of knowledge for you. But she summed up family court like this. She said, the second you start the divorce process, the family court system, the government owns your children. You're essentially signing over custody of your children. Your children are now revenue streams for unscrupulous professionals. And the more money you have, the more your family will be targeted for big ticket items like reunification therapy. That's in quotations. I don't think any victim finds reunification therapy therapeutic, and reunification camps or other relabeled intensive programs. If you try to go up against a system while trying to protect your children, you will likely lose your children. There's a scale of judges at one end that you have those who want to do the right thing, but they're grossly uneducated on what trauma and domestic abuse and child abuse looks like. So even though their heart's in the right place, they're not educated on it or what the right thing to do is for those children. In the middle, you have judges suffering from compassion fatigue. They've become callous and insensitive to what survivors and children are experiencing. Now, at the far end of that scale, you have collusion and corruption, the AFCC players. That stands for the Association of Family and Consolation Courts, who are, by definition, trafficking children. The family court system is a racket, but it's not broken. It's operating the way it was designed to operate. I couldn't agree more with Tina. So I want to talk quite a bit about court and the enablement of abusers by judges. And we're going to dive into future episodes, all the reasons why courts fail women. But today I want to talk about a bad judge who specifically is not punishing criminals. And we're going to talk about a lot of reasons why some elected official who's up for his seat pandering to criminals for endorsement, and many more reasons. So find a comfy seat and sit down because your girl's going to blow up a Houston judge's spot right now. DaSean Jones is a member of the Democratic Socialist Party, and one of his main platforms is not giving harsh punishments to criminals. It seems like a weird position to take, so I asked myself, why? Why is that this man's platform? Is he just pandering to criminals for votes? Because my attitude has always been that the punishment should fit the crime. I don't think petty criminals should have their lives ruined. They definitely need to be punished to learn lessons. But I think people who commit acts of violence or sexual deviance should literally have the book thrown at them. Make their lives a living hell. So it's hard for me to wrap my brain around why a judge, somebody who is undoubtedly intelligent or at least very good student with a history of success as a lawyer to become a judge, why they would take this stance. So I try to keep an open mind always when I have this outwardly guttural reaction to something and that I just feel the opposite of. I try to research it and place myself on the opposite side of my own opinion to kind of meet people where they are and see why they have this belief. So what I found out while researching, I found an article by the Commonwealth. I'm going to link it in my show notes. And they discussed how the cash bail system disproportionately impacts people of color, fueling a pervasive problem of structural racism in our criminal justice system. Now, that's a mouthful. Essentially, what they're saying is large bail cash is impacting all of the Black people in prison who can't meet bail. And because of that, it's perpetuating racism in the prison system. Now, what I read also in this article was that almost 500,000 people in jail right now, there's about 2 million people as of May of 2024 in jail and prison in this country, but about 500,000 of those are actually innocent at this point, meaning they're in pre-trial detention. They're legally innocent and have not been found guilty yet. So some of them very well may be guilty and they're awaiting trial. But the reason they're still sitting there is because they cannot afford to post their bail. And this disproportionately affects people of low income and mental illness. And about 43% of those people are Black people. So this type of thinking makes sense to me, okay? We need prison reform and bail reform for petty crimes. It has to be logical. It cannot be for violent offenders. And that's where there's a gap here. That's this judge, he's letting violent offenders be decriminalized, not petty. So obviously we need to have better programs so there's any chance of reform and to decrease recidivism, because right now prisons and jails are places criminals go and get worse. Nobody's coming out the other side of it a better person. So I think there's some validity in there being a need to adjust bail for petty crimes like shoplifting, maybe marijuana charges for some place in this country where it's not legal right now. I'm not saying no punishment, but by locking up petty criminals with high bail they can't pay, we're exposing them to life in prison that they're adapting to, and they're coming out the side of it with more criminal behavior than when they went in. So we're actually decreasing the likelihood of them bettering themselves. So researching all of this gave me a little bit of perspective on why politicians and judges like DaSean Jones has that platform for bail and prison reform. And I'm going to give myself a little pat on the back for having an open mind, because Tressa a few years ago would never. I've been trying to unpack, or as trendy people say, deconstruct some of the views that I've held for a long time. As I've navigated this social justice journey, I want everyone on all sides of the aisle to be represented, because I think that the safety of women and the mental health of women and children and domestic violence victims, even men, all of them, I don't think that it should be partisan, right? And it's not always black and white. There's really a lot of gray areas. So I try and see all sides of it. I'm trying to be more amiable in my biases and just meet people where they are. A few years ago, I was actually very pro death penalty. And now that pendulum has swung the other way. And it's swung the other way, ironically, because I stumbled upon a podcast by a man named Jason Flom called Wrongful Conviction. I know I'm going off on a tangent here, but just go on the ride with me. I'll loop it back around. But I had always thought that when somebody was on death row, it was because they're guilty. Like just, lock them up. It's obviously they wouldn't be there if there wasn't some hard evidence, if we didn't have solid proof. I grew up watching Dateline and 2020 and Unsolved Mysteries and all these things, Law and Order SVU, where if you're guilty and there's no doubt. It's never wrong. I had no idea the high rates of eyewitness misidentification. I didn't realize false confessions even occurred. I didn't know there were coerced pleas, official misconduct, and so much more. There's been several innocent people actually exonerated from death row by DNA after spending years or decades of their life in prison for a crime they didn't commit. And so many of those wrongfully convicted people are convicted because they're minorities from socioeconomically challenging backgrounds who couldn't afford strong legal representation. And quite frankly, they're there because at some point they encountered a racist bias in the system. So all of this to say, I think as a nation, we have to find a way to be able to look at all sides if we want to heal this country and the broken and corrupt systems within. We have to compromise party lines or we'll never heal this nation. We have to look at our closely held assumptions of how things work and be willing to reassess. So, I still think like pedophile murderer that, I still want to bury him in the backyard myself, a little vigilante justice or prison justice for them. But, if one innocent person is put to death, it's one too many. So that's what made me reassess. So anyways, I do the research. I come to the assumption that there may be some validity in the argument for lowering bail for petty crimes, blah, 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 blah. But I stand on the fact that the punishment must fit the crime. Okay, so now I'm understanding this Judge DaSean Jones. But even with my newly discovered empathy and understanding of some of his opinions, I still come to the same conclusion. He was negligent and he caused death, and he should be punished. So I want to talk about one specific case and corrupt judge today, and I'm going to get there, but it's important to note that the controversy with Judge DaSean Jones is not a one-off. He has been the center of controversy among Houstonians for a few years now, and they've been growing increasingly impatient within the past few years because he's earned a reputation as pro-criminal. His position is an elected seat, and he narrowly kept that seat in the 2022 contested re-election race. His current term ends on the final day of 2026. However, a notably large group of Houston residents in the metropolitan area want to show him the way out immediately. Despite them trying to forcibly remove him and questioning his competency in recent years, he remains. But one of the most notable reasons that Judge DaSean is so heavily disliked is because of a man named Taryn Green. That may ring a bell for you, and it may ring a bell for you because he was very, very prevalent in the news in 2023. He was a felon with a barrage of crimes that spanned decades, and many of his crimes violent felonies, including aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, drug possession with intent to distribute, evading arrest in a motor vehicle, I think that means high-speed chase, and theft between $20,000 and $100,000. But none of that mattered, though, because despite all of that, he was a man about town. He was running around like he owned it, thanks to a $55,000 bond that Judge DaSean Jones settled on. For those of you who do not know how bail works, let me tell you, I happen to know thanks to a false accusation by my ex-husband that was, of course, dismissed because it wasn't real, but I happen to know how it works when you post your bail. So the way it works is you'll be given a bail amount. And in order to be released from jail, you have to post 10% of that. And you can use a money or collateral to pay that to the court to ensure you'll show up at your set trial date. But a judge sets the bail amount based on the severity of the crime. The defendant can then be released from jail and will receive their money back when they appear in court as scheduled. If they fail to appear, their bail is forfeited and they'll be arrested. So the bail bond agency pays that bail for you. They take a fee. The defendant usually pays a 10% amount of the bail money to the agency, and the agency will secure the rest with collateral. Then they charge a premium fee on the bail amount. So for a person like Taryn Green with a lengthy criminal history and the severity of his crimes, most of the time his bail would be significant, especially since he was facing multiple felonies. But the judge set his bail at a measly $55,000, which, isn't pocket litter, but he was able to post it, and out he went. At around this same time, a deputy, Joseph Anderson of the Harris County Sheriff's Office, came upon Taryn Green in traffic and did a routine traffic stop for some infraction. Without any provoking, Taryn Green ambushed that officer and opened fire on him, hitting him multiple times in the torso. He fled the scene, which ignited a massive manhunt that would go over 24 hours of searching for Taryn. Now, luckily, that officer was life-flighted to a hospital where his life was saved with surgery. After those 24 hours, Green was found to be holed up at a house in the Humble neighborhood in Northeast Houston. Members of the U.S. Marshals and Gulf Coast Violent Offenders Task Force approached the residence, and gunfire again ensued. A sheriff's deputy and 2 U.S. Marshals were injured by Taryn Green, but by some grace of God, all survived with non-life-threatening injuries. After that shooting, Taryn barricaded himself in the home for 5 hours, but SWAT finally extracted him by running through the building with an armored vehicle. He has now been charged with 4 counts of attempted capital murder. So upon looking over Taryn Green's history, it was noted that he was actually violating the terms of his bond and should have never been free, right? This man was free because of errors by the court. And I cannot tell you how many times I see this. There's actually another case. I'm going to do a bonus episode and release it next week that I'm going to cover another court system that had a ton of errors in following someone's bond. And that man killed a woman. But Taryn hadn't showed up for court for a warrant issued to him, so the court should have brought him back into custody. So why was he free on bond during the time he nearly killed 4 police officers? Something called the O'Donnell Consent Decree contributed to this. So, long story long, I'm going to try and sum this up because we're getting in the weeds, but the decree came about in 2016 when a set of plaintiffs claimed that bail practices for misdemeanor arrestees were unconstitutional. A very long-winded explanation in here somewhere, but I want to get to the crux of what I really want to talk about today, so I'm going to paraphrase. The decree determined that there should be a drop in the financial value of misdemeanor bonds set by courts to 1/10 the pre-consent decree amount, meaning violent offenders would be out much quicker if given bail options. The goal of the decree was not to keep persons accused of minor offenses in jail because they can't afford bail. But just because someone's most recent offense is a misdemeanor or a minor, that doesn't give you the full picture. You have to look at the entire rap sheet. Did that person have a long history of offenses and they're high risk if released? Because that's what Taryn was. Very high risk. If anyone looked at his history clearly, he was a hardened criminal. But it was $55,000 that he was released on. So he came up with $5,000. And that's certainly less than what most violent serial offenders would be given. So this is the case that put DaSean Jones on the map of inadequate judges and pro-criminal judges, and one whose validity we now question. Now, Texas has a very torrid history with effing up bonds and charges, and one woman is dead this month as a result of those errors. Jackelyn Wilson, a mother of 4 children, was murdered in front of her children in early October, despite trying to unsuccessfully get a restraining order and years of abuse that the court had history of. I believe she was killed on October 3rd, around 2 weeks ago. Let's back up and introduce the man that murdered her. Howard Devin Ruffin, 39, is currently sitting in jail for the killing of 32-year-old Jackelyn. Jackelyn was at home in her apartment getting her 4-year-old and 6-year-old sons ready to go to the bus stop for school when a Ring camera would capture the chilling sound of her murder. Actually, there's video of it online you can find. Leading up to the death of Jackelyn, the couple had a history of abuse, or rather, he had a history of abusing her. And Jackelyn tried to separate herself from Howard without success for a couple of years, and no help from the court system in Texas. They'd been together around 5 years. I'm not sure exactly how much of that was off or on, but it's clear that 3 years ago, Howard was convicted for assaulting a different family member. 2 years ago, he was charged in Harris County for hitting and strangling Jackelyn Wilson. Now, I've said this over and over again on all of my platforms, but I'm going to say it again just in case it's the first time that you are listening to me. The number one predictor of whether or not an abuser will kill a victim is if they have ever strangled or choked them. If an abuser has ever put their hands around your neck, the likelihood of them murdering you is increased by 750%. There are certain forms of abuse that can actually be an indicator of the likelihood of death, and choking and strangulation is the biggest predictor. If they've strangled you, they're most likely to kill you in the next year. While all forms should be taken seriously, if you're out there listening and you're with an abuser who has even just wrapped his hand around your neck for a brief moment in anger, you need to leave. Make a safety plan and get the out. And I don't say that lightly. Now, and he had a warrant that was a felony that he should have been arrested for, but it was not categorized and he was never brought in on that felony. The list of failures the state committed that led to this woman's death is seriously unfathomable. I mean, he was erroneously released from jail. He was given a $7,500 bond for his assault charge because it was mistakenly labeled. Whoopsies. I mean, Harris County records show they didn't learn about his bond in another county for 16 months. They only discovered it last week. So all of these mess ups, right? He gets out of jail on that $7,500 bond, and he goes straight to Jackelyn's apartment. And he can be seen, like I said, on the door cam entering her apartment. And you see him just casually roll in, and you hear him yell what I deciphered. I think it is, "Call the police? Go ahead, go ahead, go ahead." Then a barrage of gunfire rings out over and over. And her 4-year-old and 6-year-old stood as witnesses while their mom was murdered. They ran to the bus stop where they found a familiar adult. And that adult said, "Boys, you just missed the bus." To which the 6-year-old boy responded, "Yeah, we know, but he shot Mom." The witness would follow the boys back to the apartment where they found Jackelyn gasping for air in her final moments in life. They tried all efforts to save her, but when the police got there, she died on the scene. One of the neighbors would report that she actually overheard Howard within the last week say to Jackelyn, "Okay, bitch, I'm going to kill you." Jackelyn had kicked him out of her residence, and on Monday, the neighbor reported that she saw Jackelyn putting some of Ruffin's belongings outside of the apartment. She then reported seeing Ruffin sitting at the complex in his car in a dark SUV watching that apartment. Very common that abusers watch and stalk. Listen, I just want to say, as a survivor of DV, there were so many neighbors in the 5 years I was with my ex-husband in multiple neighborhoods and houses who overheard things that they could have called 911 to help. I didn't have access to a phone probably 99% of the time because he broke them. If that's ever you overhearing, I implore you to be the nosy neighbor and call the cops. Report anonymously. I mean, you don't have to get involved. You don't want to be on that person's radar, but just ask for a welfare check. And this morning, I actually heard this lady berating what I thought was her husband or child. And so I walked my dog over that way to listen a little bit. Just let her know my presence was known, because it sounded like she was just shaming the crap out of somebody. And I got closer, and she was standing next to her dog and her trash was spread everywhere. And she was shaming him for eating all of the trash. But my point is, if you see something, let your presence be known. Say something. If you hear an altercation or verbal abuse, call for a welfare check. Now, I looked over previous complaints and reports against Ruffin, right? I actually pulled this guy's rap sheet or his criminal record from Intellius. I do that with everyone. If you're online dating, you should too. Intellius, okay? This was a mile long. I was going to print it so I could pull it up and read it and just have it as easy access, but it was 37 pages and I didn't want to waste that much paper. So I quit. But essentially what you have, I went back to 2003. He had like 5 misdemeanors that year, a lot of failure to give identity in crimes. He had a felony in 2003 for aggravated assault, like 10 misdemeanors in 2005 and 2004, misdemeanors for theft, felony robbery, 2005, misdemeanors hit and run of a fixed object, felony, misdemeanor, 2009, felony aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, misdemeanor, open container, misdemeanor, no valid license, misdemeanor, disturbing the peace, 2014 DUI, 2016 DUI, 2018 DUI, failure to have a child buckled in while driving, awesome, misdemeanor, driving without license, misdemeanor, 2021 assault, domestic violence causing bodily injury, felony aggravated assault. Okay, guys, 37 pages. This guy is a career criminal and not a very good one. And ironically, he got a $7,500 bail with all of that available to the judge to access. This wasn't a petty crime. This wasn't some guy who stole a pack of cigarettes or who broke open an ATM and took the money. He did those things too. But this was also a guy who had several felonies for aggravated assault. This should be no surprise what he was capable of. People know exactly who guys like Howard Ruffin is. They're monsters. They're women beaters. They're people who commit assault and crimes. They're serial offenders. And the best predictor of what a man will do in the future is what he's done in the past. And Jackelyn knew she was in trouble, so she told police. She did exactly what she was supposed to do. But the people who were sworn to protect and serve her, those sitting in elected seats who were supposed to represent the people's needs and serve the constituents, failed her. And she was murdered by a career criminal. And nobody was surprised by the outcome because the judicial system had been failing Jackelyn this entire time. And nobody was less surprised than Jackelyn's own mother. When a homicide investigator showed up to notify Denise Bips of the murder of her daughter, she knew right away what had happened. Denise said the investigator told her that her daughter Jackelyn was dead, and her response was, "Did Howard Ruffin kill my daughter?" She says there was no doubt in her mind. Denise shared that her daughter had never been in an abusive relationship like this one before. And now she has 4 grandchildren that have been left to survive this. And no doubt that will endure the trauma for years to come. Ruffin's criminal history, all of the aggravated assaults involving romantic partners, various mishandlements, not communicating county to county. Listen, in this day and age with technology, there's no excuse for counties not communicating that he had a felony he was on bond for. That was for 16 months. No one was watching him and making sure he was even meeting any terms of a bond or see what he was doing. So he ended up getting stopped in April of 2023 in South Texas. And the cops realized he had been walking around with a felony warrant. And that's when he got the $7,500 bond when he was arrested in that Maverick County. I know it's very, very confusing. I'm bouncing all around, but essentially the man got a felony for aggravated assault, and then he got another felony for beating up Jackelyn, and it was supposed to be a felony, but it was labeled a misdemeanor, and he was supposed to be brought in for the felony, and it never happened because of miscommunications. And so for 16 months, Harris County literally had no idea he was out on bond, and they don't know where he was or what the conditions were. So fast forward, and on September 25th, he finally appears back in Harris County court system in the 180th court in front of none other than Judge DaSean Jones, the bleeding heart for criminals himself. And that judge decided, after looking at that man's violent history, that the $7,500 bond he was given in Maverick County for that misdemeanor, that was actually a felony, would suffice. He didn't raise it a dime, and so Harris walked out of jail and he went to Jackelyn's house and he killed her. This is a prime example of negligence of the court systems and counties not communicating the bare minimum of the court system. This could have and should have been prevented. And now Ruffin is behind bars. No bail has been set. You know, I'm outraged. I'm exhausted of women being killed, but more than just that, these are very preventable deaths because we don't punish these men until they kill. They assault and assault and assault, and the judges look the other way. And when they kill, they go, how'd this happen? Jackie Wilson's 4 children don't have a mother because of DaSean Jones. DaSean Jones, you have blood on your hands. I want to continue to focus on judges in the court system not taking domestic violence seriously. When I posted the story about my ex-husband, the number of men, well, there are a lot of positive men. I love men. First of all, I don't want to sound like I'm hating men, but the number of men who doubted the validity was maddening. They were like, this can't be the case. They always side with women. But the number of women saying this happened to me in Georgia, Missouri, Colorado, this becoming the rule, not the exception. I want to dive more into why judges are either complacent in the abuse of women or actively aiding abusers and getting away with crimes, because there's arguments for why both happens. There are so many different rabbit holes to go down, but today I'll leave you with this. Jackelyn Wilson was a beautiful soul and mother by all accounts. She did nothing wrong, and she deserves so much better than what happened to her. And it was absolutely a preventable death. It should have and could have been prevented. If you have the ability to contribute to Jackelyn's family, please go check out her GoFundMe. It's going to be linked in my show notes from today. It's also linked on my TikTok at Tressa.Brady. It's linked on my Instagram, which is HealTheWounded13. If you're currently in an abusive relationship, please be safe. My favorite quote I'm going to leave you with is by Brene Brown. She said, "One day, you will tell your story of how you overcame what you went through, and it will become someone else's survival guide." Thanks for listening. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you think this content would be helpful for someone you know, please share the link with them. Sources can be found in the show notes of today's episode.